JP, I've always been fascinated about God. I'd like to believe God exists. And one of the things that helped me to see if this being does exist is to look at what God's attributes might be. One of them that's frequently talked about is perfection.
Yes.
That God is perfect. Why does God have to be perfect?
Well, I'm not sure that's the right question.
It's my question.
Well, yeah, bless your heart. The question isn't why does he have to be, but what does it mean for him to be? That's a different question. So let's get clear on what it means to say God's perfect, and then we'll try to ask the question of why he has to be that.
Don't forget it.
Yeah, I'll do my best. To say that God is perfect means that there is no possible world where he has his attributes to a greater degree. That is to say, God doesn't happen to be the most loving being around, though he could become more loving in 100 years. God is not the most loving being that happens to exist. He's the most loving being that could possibly exist. So that God's possessing the attribute of being loving is to a degree such that it is impossible for him to have it to a greater degree. So when we describe God as perfect, we mean that the attributes that he possesses, his what are called value-making attributes, his being wise and kind and gentle and just and fair, he possesses these to a degree such that it's impossible for him to have them to a greater degree. So that's what it means for him. He doesn't have these to some finite degree such that he could grow in them as time goes on.
That means that God cannot improve in these categories.
That's right.
Now, to me, that might be an imperfection because you can't get better.
In fact, the medieval theologians said that there are a lot of things that we can do that God can't do. For example, I can grow in courage. He can't. I can run a 100-yard dash. He can't. But of course, in the next breath, they said, this really isn't a limitation on God, it's a limitation on me, because the only reason that I can grow in courage is because I don't have all I can have. The only reason I can run a 100-yard dash is because I'm not at all the places in space at the same time.
I'm glad you brought up courage, because courage is part of being as good as you can be. How could courage exist if you are an omnipotent being? What are you afraid of?
I think that that's part of what it means to be an omnipotent being. Because after all, courage is the absence of fear. It's the strength of one's character without fear. And God's courage means that there is nothing that threatens him. So that there are two different kinds of courage. There is a self-existent necessary form of courage, which admittedly is the absence of fear, based on the full knowledge that no one could threaten God. There's another kind of courage that is finite and can grow. There are certain things about growing in courage that are wonderful, but God's courage is such that he doesn't grow in it. And so I would turn the question around and say, how could an omnipotent being fail to have courage? Because courage is due to the knowledge that you can't be threatened.
No, I would say courage is the character trait that if you are threatened, you are able for a higher purpose to accomplish something else, but under the threat. It's a semantic argument of how you define courage.
Well, there might be differences between finite courage that can grow and an infinite courage that is self-existent and can't grow. So there are things they have in common, but things that they have different.
Let's talk about God's development.
Yes.
Because God has certain stages, because you didn't exist forever.
That's right.
And now there's a sphere of existence in which J.P. Moreland
That's
exists.
Right.
So God is different in the sense in
Yes.
that God's worldview now has J.P. Moreland in it, whereas it at one point did not. So in God's perception of things, God has changed, or God has, I would say, improved, because J.P. Moreland has come into existence.
Well, I think what we have to do is to try to explain how a being could be self-contained and still have experiences that are meaningful and enjoyable to God. It's almost like adding 50 to infinity doesn't increase infinity. I mean, you can add as many finite numbers as you want to infinity, and it doesn't increase the size of infinity. So there's a sense in which God can take on joy without it improving his life in a way that would be true for limited beings. And I think the problem with the analogy between us and God breaks down precisely at the point of dealing with an infinite, maximally perfect being compared to the way we experience these things finitely. So I would say that God's life is enriched by my presence, but not as I would be enriched in the sense that with the privation of that enrichment, there's something lacking that makes my life less perfect.
I think the problem comes to how you're defining perfection, because there is a tendency sometime to define perfection as changeless.
Well, God is not static, right? God is not some abstract Platonic form sitting out there timelessly without change. When God creates the world, he dynamically interacts with it. He derives joy from interacting with us, enjoying his creation.
In real
time. Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, there is a long tradition in Christian philosophy, as you well know, that has God being changeless, immutable, impassible, nothing can affect God. It's this aloof, changeless, non-physical thing.
Right. But the bottom line here is we've got to understand that our discussions of God have a literal point of contact with us, but then a disanalogy. So when we say that God is capable of enjoying me, like I can enjoy my wife, that's literally the case in God's life. But when I come to enjoy something new, it represents an improvement of my life in a way that it doesn't for a being that is already maximally perfect.
And that's a difference with a distinction?
It is.
So why couldn't you define... so you're defining perfection as something that is as perfect as it can be now, but it becomes a better perfection, like a higher level of infinity?
Well, the concepts of better don't apply to it, because the concept of being better only applies to a finite.
How about bigger?
Well, again...
well, bigger, you have J.P. Moreland now in his world.
Well, God
bigger.
isn't bigger, but the things that he relates to, there are more things he relates to.
So as time goes on, God is expanding the things that he relates to?
Sure, he has more experiences than he did. I mean, he's aware of me now. He knew me ahead of time, but now he's actually aware of me because I'm real. Yeah, all those things represent changes in God, but they don't represent growth or improvement in some way such that he's not perfect. So that's where the analogy becomes hard for us to understand, I think.
The relationship between God and humans,
yes,
under no condition improves God's perfection.
Yes, that's right. But it enriches his life without improving him.
And that distinction is an important one.
I think so, and I think it's a real distinction. And I think that the hesitancy of thinking it's a real distinction derives from the fact that we often apply these distinctions to finite beings that aren't perfect. So that's, I think, the problem.
The goal of human beings in the Christian tradition would be to have eternal life and in many respects to be like God. Now, will that involve a similar kind of perfection?
No, because we'll always be finite. I mean, we're never going to be...
Because we had a beginning.
Well, yes, but also we have limitations in knowledge because we're not infinite beings. And so the goal of life is to know and love God and others, and to pursue goodness, truth, and beauty forever, and enjoy these things together with others we love, with God at the center of that community.
And when God created the world and people and the opportunity for growth and all of that, that creation was part of God's perfection, or it was God would still have been just as perfect if he didn't do any of this?
God would have been just as perfect if he hadn't done any of this, but his life has been enriched by the experiences he's had with the creation he adores.
So the God that you believe in would be as legitimate a God, as a proper recipient of worship, even if God never did anything but just remained in this pre-creation condition, just with the God and whoever else is
In
part
fact, only that kind of a God is worthy of complete worship, and here's why. Suppose God were capable of improving, and suppose that my worship of God was directed toward His worthiness, His excellence. And I was worshiping Him, but I knew that in 15 years He would be smarter and better and kinder, and He would have grown. Well, then my worship should grow as well, so that the worship I would give Him now should be limited. It shouldn't be my complete worship, because I shouldn't worship Him more than what He's worthy of. It's only a maximally perfect being that is incapable of improving that would be worthy of my total allegiance. Otherwise, I ought to hedge my bets a bit, knowing that maybe down the road I should be worshiping Him more fully, because He'll be better than He is now.
But it's the best He could be now, so
Sure.
it's certainly, I would think, worthy of worship. He created the universe and everything else. But you might
Well,
hold,
He'd be worthy of
you
worship,
might
but
hold-
not my total commitment.
You might hold back a little bit.
Right.
So when you reflect on it in total, what is your feeling about God and God's perfection?
That God is the standard of perfection for all finite imperfection, that God is not capable of being improved upon, but He's not a static being that doesn't change and is not capable of enjoying and interacting richly with a creation that is growing and changing.